Ready?
You're
Welcome back to Millersville. Welcome back to the Ville. It's certainly been an unusual time in state history, an unusual time in our nation's history with the coronavirus and our response to it. But it's good to be back with you. We're going to try to do the remainder of our class sessions by videotape, and they will be placed on YouTube. You will get information by email on how to find them, how to access them, and you should bring up your PowerPoints that I've already sent you, or run them off on your copier, on your printer, and have them at hand as you listen to this presentation. Okay, so go to your PowerPoints and run them off on your printer and have those PowerPoints by you as we go through the remainder of our lectures together. I've missed you guys, and it's good to be with you again. And you have my telephone number, and you have my email, so that if you need anything, you just go ahead and email me, and we could set up a possible telephone conversation as well if you'd like, no problem. Okay? All right. When we left off, we were talking about elections. We'd gone through the different types of elections, and we were at the point, I know I finished this with one of the sections, but I didn't with the other. We wanted to talk about explanations for voting. Why do people vote the way they do? And you find that in the one class we covered this very well. In the other class, there are 3 reasons why people vote the way they do. Really only 3 broad reasons. What are they? Well, number 1 is the most important, is partisanship. Whatever party that you are affiliated with, you tend to vote for. So if you're a Democrat, you tend to vote for Democrats. If you're a Republican, you tend to vote Republican. And that has been the most powerful reason why we vote the way we do. Of course, what's the reason that we tell one another why we vote the way we do? Of course, that reason would be the public policy ideas of the candidate, right? The positions that the candidate holds. We always say that we're voting the man, not the party, or the woman, not the party. But you find, lo and behold, that this isn't as powerful as the partisan affiliation, but it still should be perhaps the reason why we're voting the way we do. Thirdly and finally would be candidate characteristics. We tend to vote for someone because they have a characteristic that's appealing to us. Just like in 1960, Senator Kennedy, John F. Kennedy from Massachusetts, was voted for president by many people because JFK was a Catholic, and many Catholics voted for him for president for that reason alone. As I mentioned to the one class, one section that covered this, we had the Amish in Lancaster County registering en masse in 1960 to vote in the presidential election. Why? Because they were worried that if John F. Kennedy was elected as president, that he would turn the White House over to the Pope, that the Pope would run American public policy. So the Amish all went out en masse, and they registered to vote against John F. Kennedy. In the last presidential election, many women voted for Hillary Clinton because she was a woman. We find the city of Philadelphia, of course, the career of former Mayor Rizzo. Frank Rizzo started out as a beat cop, worked his way up to police commissioner, made Philadelphia the safest of all the 5 major cities in America, and later ran for mayor and became a Democratic mayor of Philadelphia. He served 2 terms, he was term limited, and then he had to leave the mayor's position. He went into talk radio, and he had his own talk radio show in Philadelphia. And in a future mayoral contest, he felt that the city was going downhill, and so he came out of retirement and ran for mayor again, only this this time he had ran as a Republican. He felt that his party, the Democratic Party, had left him. He had not left them. So he acquired the Republican nomination, and the general election was only 1 month away, and he was ahead in all the polls. You would have had a Republican winning as mayor of Philadelphia, but he died of a massive heart attack just prior to the election. But why? What was his appeal in Philadelphia? His appeal in Philadelphia was that he was a local man. He was a Catholic. He was from South Philly. He was a former police commissioner who had presided over a very peaceful city. So candidate characteristics were the reason why many people wanted to vote for him again as mayor. So these are the three major explanations for voting. Let's go on to the next PowerPoint, and that would be the three categories of elections. There are only three types of elections: a maintaining election, a deviating election, and a critical election. A maintaining election is one in which the majority stays the majority. You find that maintaining election would be 1964. The Democratic Party was the majority party in America, and in 64 they won the presidential election and they won congressional elections, and they stayed the majority party. Another example of a maintaining election would be President Bush Jr. in 2004. The Republican Party was the majority party in the country, and it stayed the majority party in the country. Now, in addition to maintaining elections, we have deviating elections. That's when the minority win the contest, but they stay as a minority party. The majority party loses, but they still are the majority. Good examples of this would be President Eisenhower in 1952 and 56. The Republicans win the White House, and in 52 they win the House of Representatives as well. They are the minority party, but they were able to win, but they were still the minority party nationwide. Another example would be President Clinton when he won the presidency in 1992 and 1996. Again, the Democrats were the minority party at that point, and they stayed the minority party, but Governor Clinton and then President Clinton won election nonetheless. So those are examples of deviating elections. From there, we go to the critical election. The critical election is one in which the minority party wins, the majority party loses. The majority party now becomes a minority or disappears altogether. The minority party becomes the majority. This is a critical election. Critical election in American history is called a realignment. And if you go to your next PowerPoint is critical elections in American history, and I'd like you to memorize those. What are the critical elections in American history? First you have 1800. Of course, then you have 1824, 1860, 1896, 1932, 1968, and we're still trying to determine if 2008, with the election of President Obama, was a critical election or if it was not. We're not sure that a realignment took place there or not, and we can talk about that in a minute. But let's go back and go through the critical elections very quickly, and I do want you to learn them. In 1800, we find that the Federalist Party is in power, right? We find that who's the president in 1800? Well, it's John Adams. John Adams, of course, was a Federalist. He was George Washington's vice president. Then he succeeded Washington after Washington served 2 terms. John Adams, came into office and won that election to be president in 1796. He's running for re-election in 1800. He's running against his own vice president, Thomas Jefferson. At that point, you find that the president and the vice president didn't run together as a ticket as they do now in the Electoral College. They were close friends, but you find the election of 1800 became very bitter, and they became quite angry with one another, quite frankly. And friendship waned for many, many years. But the election of 1800 is one in which the Federalist Party was the majority party in the country, and Thomas Jefferson prevailed in the election of 1800. So the Federalist Party loses its majority position in the country, and the Democratic Republican Party of Thomas Jefferson becomes the majority party. So that's the election of 1800. The election of 1800 is the most significant and most important election in American history. And we say this because it's the first time ever that what happened. It's the first time ever that you find the party in power has to relinquish it, and it does so peacefully. They surrender power through ballots, not bullets. And that is why it has to be the most significant and most important election in American history. You'll find that there were a number of Adams's advisors who were counseling him, do not surrender the White House, do not let Jefferson and his rabble followers come into the White House. You can invoke the Alien and Sedition Acts and keep Jefferson out of the White House, but Adams chose not to do so, and we had a peaceful transfer of power. So the election of 1800 stands out among all of our critical elections. The next critical election is 1824. What happens? Well, we find that the Federalist Party slowly but surely lost power as time went by. You find that where was the base of the Federalist Party? New England. Where was the base of the Democratic Republican Party? The South. Who was determining who the president was? Who was determining the balance of power? The Middle Atlantic area was. That would be New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. They were determining who the president was going to be and who would control the Congress. Well, we find that, look at the elections. 1800, Jefferson wins. He wins re-election in 1804. Then who's the next president? Well, it's his own Secretary of State and his own neighbor and his trusted political ally, James Madison. So James Madison is elected in 1808, and you have Madison serving 2 terms as well. And then who's the next president? Well, another Jefferson and Madison neighbor, James Monroe, whose house is Ash Lawn, just about 2 miles away from Monticello, designed by Jefferson for Monroe's inhabitants. At any rate, you find Monroe then becomes president for 2 terms, and he was Madison's Secretary of State. So you have the Democratic Republican Party winning 2 terms under Jefferson, 2 terms under Madison, 2 terms under Monroe. Well, look at the pathway to the presidency. The pathway to the presidency is the Secretary of State's position. Who is James Monroe's Secretary of State? None other than John Adams's own son, John Quincy Adams. So John Quincy Adams is scheduled next to be the leader of the party of the Democratic Republican Party, when his father was one of the leaders and one of the formers of the Federalist Party. The Federalist Party was waning away. After 1816, the Federalist Party no longer submits a presidential contender. They no longer compete for the presidency, and they become more of a regional party. The Democratic Republican Party now seems to be in command at the national level, and their caucus in the U.S. House of Representatives becomes known as King Caucus, because at this point, how do we nominate presidential candidates? We do it through the 2 caucuses in the U.S. House of Representatives. And since the Democratic Republican Party was winning all the presidential elections between 1800 and 1824, they became known as King Caucus, with the president being the closest thing that we have to a king. Well, John Quincy Adams was the Secretary of State, and so he was the candidate of the Republican Party in 1824. Well, the party also decided that they'd like Andrew Jackson to be the vice presidential candidate. Lo and behold, Andy Jackson, of course, was a very proud man. His reputation in American history, of course, is consolidated by what? Consolidated by the fact that he commanded the American forces at the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812. And of course, the interesting thing about the Battle of New Orleans is it was fought after the war was over, but we didn't know the war was over yet. The communications hadn't arrived from overseas. But Andy Jackson's a very proud man, and he says he will be no one's number two. And rather than accept the vice presidential nomination of the Democratic Republican Party, he says, I'm running for the presidency as well. I'm not going to be John Quincy Adams's water carrier. Well, the interesting thing is that the caucus of the Democratic Republican Party even had a slogan for the campaign, and it was John Quincy Adams, he sure can write, and Andy Jackson, he sure can fight. Remember the origin of that? John Quincy Adams, remember, we now know today was probably our most intelligent president ever. His brain was wired in a different way than most anyone else's. What could John Quincy Adams do? He could take a pen in his left hand and a pen in his right hand, and he could write two letters simultaneously. Well, he could write one letter simultaneously. One hand was writing in Latin, the other hand was writing in Greek. If you try that today, it's hard enough to write one letter in English sometimes, isn't it? But John Quincy Adams was a brilliant man. We find that the election was held, and sure enough, John Quincy Adams, the war hero, received the largest number of popular votes, and he received the largest number of electoral college votes. However, who won the election? The election was won by John Quincy Adams, not by Andrew Jackson, because what is required to win the presidency? A majority, 50% plus one, a majority of the electoral college votes. Andrew Jackson didn't have this. Remember, when neither candidate has a majority of electoral college votes, who decides who the president is? The U.S. House of Representatives. And when the matter went to the U.S. House of Representatives, the two major vote getters in the Electoral College are sent before the House for consideration. Well, this leads to one of the most interesting sagas in American history. We find, of course, in the election of 1824, you not only had John Quincy Adams running, but you also had Henry Clay. Once Andy Jackson got into the mix, Henry Clay had to get in the mix, because where's Andy Jackson from? Tennessee. What state hates Tennessee? Kentucky. So Henry Clay wasn't having any of Andy Jackson being in the White House, so he announced his candidacy for the presidency as well. And in an interesting turn of events, you find that Henry Clay was probably the most powerful politician in the country at that time, but he wasn't going to give that honor of being president to Andy Jackson. So he announces for the presidency as well. Then you have one of the two U.S. senators from Georgia also announcing a fourth candidate running for the presidency as well. Well, the top two vote getters are John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. And we find that once the matter goes before the U.S. House of Representatives, the Speaker of the House is Henry Clay. Henry Clay approaches John Quincy Adams and says, I will have all my followers vote for you, and I will try to give you procedural, since I control the floor activity in the U.S. House of Representatives, I'll try to give rulings that will be in favor of you. And in return, for me swinging the election to you, I want to be your Secretary of State, the pathway to the presidency. And this is called the deal that the devil done, the deal that the devil accomplished. At any rate, we find that the matter goes before the U.S. House of Representatives, and John Quincy Adams is elected as the winner of the presidential election of 1824. This leads to the end of the Democratic-Republican Party. The Democratic-Republican Party was like a balloon at this point that was blown into over and over and over and over again. Everybody was becoming a Democratic-Republican because that's where the action was. That was the party that was going to win national elections until the balloon burst in 1824. And when the balloon burst, you had the Democratic Party being formed by the followers of Andy Jackson. Andy Jackson is magnanimous in defeat. He stays in Washington to the inaugural in March, and he attends John Quincy Adams' inaugural, and he's very pleasant. However, his followers are disgusted, frustrated, furious, and they meet in churches, they meet in general stores, they meet in private homes, and they form their own political party, the new political party, the Democratic Party. So the real father of the Democratic Party in America is Andy Jackson. It's certainly not Thomas Jefferson. Okay? Well, you find that for every action in physics, there's a reaction. The same thing is true in politics. For every movement, there's a counter-movement. And you find that there were still many Federalists who were left over, and there were lots of Democratic Republicans who didn't like Andy Jackson. So they merged forces, and the remaining Federalists and the Democratic Republicans who were opposed to Andy Jackson formed a new political party, the Whig Party, W-H-I-G, the Whig Party. So out of the election of 1824, you have a critical election, you have a realignment, and you have two new political parties, the Democratic Party and the Whig Party. Well, the next presidential election that serves as a realignment and as a critical election can be found in 1860. What happened during this period of time? You find that between 1824 and 1860, these two parties are solidify their position, the Democratic Party and the Whig Party. The Democrats in the South, of course, want to keep slavery. Democrats in the North are not so keen on keeping slavery, but they don't want to threaten the unity of the Republic. They want to preserve the Republic. You find the Whigs, on the other hand, the Whigs in the South and the North, you find that they couldn't make the same accommodation that had been made in the Democratic Party. The Whigs in the South want to preserve the Union as well. The Whigs in the North say that slavery should have been abolished. They shouldn't abolish slavery today. It should have been abolished yesterday. You can't do it quickly enough. So the Whig Party became led and driven by very strong abolitionists in the North. So the Whigs couldn't make that compromise that the Democrats made between the northern and southern parts of the party. And the Whig Party started to fracture, started to splinter into new parties such as the Know Nothing Party and such as the Free Soil Party, and eventually the Republican Party as well. Now the Republican Party has its first meeting in 1854 in Jackson, Michigan. Their second meeting is in Ripon, Wisconsin, R-I-P-O-N. Ripon, Wisconsin declares itself the birthplace of the Republican Party, but it was really Jackson, Michigan where the first meeting was held. But after the party was formed, the first official meeting of the Republican Party took place in Ripon, Wisconsin. There is still a Ripon society that's a society for liberal Republicans. At any rate, you find that as we move through the 1850s, the Republicans run their first candidate for the presidency in 1856. And who might that person be? Well, that person was John C. Fremont, the great pathfinder. John C. Fremont had explored many parts of the West. and had surveyed them for maps for future settlers and for the U.S. military. He, of course, had served as well in the Mexican War as one of our generals, and later he was very important in the establishment of California. Well, John C. Fremont is the Republican candidate in 1856, and we find he's opposed by whom? You should know immediately, remember, the only president that Pennsylvania's ever had, Mr. Buchanan, James Buchanan from Lancaster. Well, Buchanan runs against Fremont, and in 1856 we find Buchanan and the Democrats do prevail. So we're on to the election of 1860 next. This is our next critical election, and we have another realignment. We have now Abraham Lincoln as the Republican candidate, and who is the Democratic candidate? Stephen Douglas is the Democratic candidate. Now, you've all heard of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. They did not occur during the presidential election of 1860. Remember, they occur during the U.S. Senate campaign of 1858. Stephen Douglas is the Democratic candidate for the U.S. Senate from the state of Illinois, and Abraham Lincoln is the Republican candidate in 1858 for the U.S. Senate seat from Illinois. We find that Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln travel throughout the state of Illinois, and they have these debates. You find these debates have just been republished in the last several years. They're still available in book form, and you can find them and read them. C-SPAN, a number of years ago, actually went to all the various sites in Illinois where these debates occurred. Many of the buildings are still there, and they had hired two actors to dress as Lincoln and Douglas, and they restaged these debates. You find that in 1860, you find that Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans are able to prevail. Now, it's interesting. Folks in the South thought that the Republican Party was going to end slavery immediately. That wasn't Lincoln's position at all. Lincoln's position was that he was going to control slavery. He was not going to permit any new states to enter the Union as slave states. He felt that if we isolated slavery, that over a period of time, it would slowly fade away. But you find that Southerners believed that the Republican Party, which was created primarily to end slavery, would try to do so immediately. We find that Lincoln had to travel to Washington for his inaugural on a specially guarded and armed train with lots of guards and sharpshooters. And they can't even go through Baltimore because Baltimore is such a pro-slavery state and there's so much civil unrest there. So the train arrives in Washington, and Lincoln is eventually sworn in. Of course, this leads eventually to the succession of South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, and the rest of the southern states. So you have the election of 1860 being a critical election and a realignment occurring there. We now have the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, and the Whig Party has faded away and disappeared. What happens between 1860 and our next critical election, of course, of 1896, is that the Republican Party is fat and happy. The Republicans, after the Civil War, they control the presidency and they control the Congress for many, many decades. Well, why? Because our politics are simply a reflection of the Civil War. We talked about this in class before, that the dynamics of the Civil War play a huge role in the creation of our political dynamics today. And you find that in northern Union states, there were more states than the southern states, so they had more representation in the Senate. You find that the northern states had a greater population than the southern states, so they could control the Electoral College and the U.S. House of Representatives. So you find that the Republicans dominate national politics all the way from 1860 all the way to 1932. But you find that as we get to the end of the 19th century, at the end of the 1800s, the Republicans are fat and happy. They're not working as hard as they did before. The Democrats, on the other hand, are working at a feverish pitch to try to become competitive in the North again. And you find that they're sending out campaign workers, they're sending out workers to meet the newly arrived immigrants at the docks. The immigrants were coming from Ireland, they were coming from the Mediterranean, from Italy, and they were coming from Eastern Europe, from Poland. And what was the Democratic Party promising them? The Democratic Party was promising them, we'll help you find a place to live, we'll help you find a job. All we ask in return is that you register as a Democrat. So the Democrats are coming back in the North. The Republicans are not going to gain strength in the South until 1968. But Democrats are coming back in the North, and it looks like the Democrats should win the election of 1896. But you find that they appoint William Jennings Bryan. They nominate William Jennings Bryan as their candidate for the presidency in 1896. The Republicans select the governor of Ohio, Mr. McKinley. And Mr. McKinley, you find, is a formidable opponent, but it looks like William Jennings Bryan might be able to defeat him. Well, what happens? The Democrats have their nominating convention in Baltimore. And during the nominating convention, you find William Jennings Bryan makes one of the most famous speeches in American history. He makes the famous Cross of Gold speech. And as he accepts the nomination, as he contends for the nomination, he says that you will not crucify us upon a cross of gold. William Jennings Bryan and his supporters were against having an exclusive gold standard. They wanted to have the free coinage of silver. That was a very popular position in the West, where you had access to silver. But if you live in any of the eastern states and the Northeast, you find that you don't have access in your backyard to silver, possible silver projects, silver mines. And you find that if you are one of those immigrants who has arrived from Italy or Poland or Ireland, where are you working? You might be working at Carnegie Steel, you might be working at Bethlehem Steel, and you find that you make a wage, and if the free coinage of silver is permitted, you have what? An expansion of the money supply. If you have an expansion of the money supply, you're going to have inflation. And if you have inflation, you have a lower standard of living. So all the immigrants who had been recruited by the Democrats run into the arms of the Republican Party for the next generation, scared and frightful of William Jennings Bryan's call for the free coinage of silver. McKinley wins the election of 1896, and the election of 1896 is the critical election that wasn't. It was the critical election that should have occurred. William Jennings Bryan, the Democrats should have won, but they didn't. So 1896 is a near miss, if you will. We find that the Republicans maintain power all the way until 1932. In 1932, they're caught up in the crosshairs of the Great Depression, which was not a national depression, it was an international depression. You find that the incumbent president in 1932 was the Republican Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover was the most brilliant Secretary of Commerce we've ever had. He was a brilliant mining engineer and had made a fortune for himself. He was considered to be the first student ever at Stanford University. Of course, Stanford preserves his memory and his legacy today through the Hoover Institution. At any rate, we find that if you look at the election of 1932, the Republican candidate is the incumbent, Herbert Hoover. The Democratic candidate is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, he is the cousin of Teddy Roosevelt. And we've already talked about the fact that he idolized Teddy and he tried to follow in his footsteps. And we already talked about the reason why he became a Democrat versus following in the footsteps of Teddy and being a Republican. At any rate, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is trying to follow in the footsteps of Teddy, so he serves as Assistant Secretary of Navy under Woodrow Wilson. He serves as governor of the state of New York. He is a vice presidential nominee. In 1928, he was the vice presidential nominee under Al Smith. Of course, Al Smith is the first Roman Catholic candidate ever for the presidency. Of course, that is 1928, was not successful. And then we eventually do find a Roman Catholic president in 1960 when John F. Kennedy wins the presidential election. Well, in 1932, Herbert Hoover sounds more liberal than Franklin Delano Roosevelt if you look at the election materials. But when FDR won the presidency, you see that he went to Columbia University, went to the leading New York State universities, tried to get the best intellectual firepower he could and brought them to Washington with him to form the New Deal. People like Oxford Tugwell came with him. And you find that in 1932, when FDR wins the nomination, that now the Republican Party becomes the minority and the Democratic Party becomes the majority. So you have a true realignment. You find that FDR serves his first term, wins re-election in 1936. In 1940, he is the second president who breaks Washington's precedent. Remember, Washington's precedent, just running for the presidency twice. Washington does that, and then he steps down voluntarily. Every president did that until whom? First president to break Washington's precedent was, of course, U.S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant served as president for 2 terms after Andrew Johnson after the Civil War. He was the savior of the Union, commander of the Northern Union Army. We find that he served 2 terms and he stepped down, just like Washington, but things weren't going well for him in private life, so he decided to come back to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, and he sought the Republican nomination for the presidency again. We find that the Republican Party denied it to him. They said, we are going to stick with Washington's precedent, and even though you were the savior of the Union, we're not going to give you a 3rd term as president. So that was not successful for Grant. Well, now FDR is looking at this. He's won 2 terms, but in 1940, he's faced with the choice. Is he going to try to run for a 3rd term of the presidency or not? He ultimately decides to do so because of the Second World War. So FDR is given his party's nomination, and he does break Washington's precedent, and it's our first president who's serving a 3rd term. You find that he runs for president again in 1944. The war's not over, and he steps up and accepts the 4th nomination of his party for the presidency, and he does win in 1944 as well. Dies several months after, and of course his vice president, Harry Truman, climbs to the presidency. So we find that in 1932, of course, we find the Great Depression we have to be very clear about it and sober-minded about it. It's not ended by the New Deal. The New Deal does help mitigate some of the worst suffering of the time. However, the Great Depression is ended by one thing, and that is the Second World War. So we have the continuation of the Democratic majority between 1932 all the way to 1968. In 1968, We find another presidential election coming up, and the Republicans turn to an old warhorse, to Richard Nixon, of course, had been the two-time vice president for Dwight David Eisenhower and had been the Republican candidate in 1960. The Democrats are looking for, they think that they're going to give the nomination to the incumbent, to Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ. But LBJ finds that in his great society, he may be making some progress in the war against poverty, but he's not making much progress in Vietnam. He doesn't understand foreign policy the way that Nixon does, and he's constantly, as we look at his tapes, in his discussions in the Oval Office of what to do in Vietnam, it was like, I don't know what to do next. I don't understand what's happening. It was a quagmire for him. He was a brilliant domestic politician, but we find that Nixon was just as brilliant a politician, but on foreign affairs. So in 1968, we have the Vietnam War going on. We also have social upheaval at home, and the country seems to be in an uproar. I'm not looking for the right term for that. So many people do turn to Richard Nixon to try to address this. And we find that he does. Richard Nixon is elected to the presidency in 1968. We find that this becomes another critical election. This becomes a realignment. The Republicans now become the majority party in America. Now the realignment is muted by the effects of Watergate after Nixon's second victory, and it's muted by the Democratic Party trying to deal with Nixon's Southern strategy. How do you deal with the Southern strategy of Nixon? Well, you put up a Southerner for the presidency, and they turn to James Earl Carter, to Jimmy Carter. And lo and behold, that does work. Jimmy Carter in the election of 1976 captures all the southern states with the exception of Virginia. We talked about this is the election in which Virginia emancipates itself from the Confederacy. But you find 4 years later, when many southern voters don't like what Jimmy Carter has done, or the achievements or lack thereof of the Carter administration, you find that all the southern states vote against Jimmy Carter in the election of 1980, with the exception of his home state of Georgia. So we find 1968 is another critical election, another realignment. The Republican Party now is the majority party, and the realignment becomes quite obvious as Ronald Reagan wins the presidential elections of 1980, 84, and George Bush, his vice president, wins in 1988. Well, we find the Republicans continue as the majority party through the country up to the election of 2008. Since 2008, we've had mixed signals. Was 2008 and the election of Barack Obama a critical election? Has there been a realignment? I can't tell you one way or the other. We find that Barack Obama won in 2008, and then he wins in 2012. However, we find the Republicans, on the other hand, in midterm elections make great progress and control over 3/4 of all the state houses and the governorships, and eventually they capture both houses of the Congress. This eventually leads to 2016, where everyone expected the Democrats and Hillary Clinton to win the presidency. And again, the Republicans win with Donald Trump, and the Republicans are able to win the Senate and the House for 2 years. The Democrats win control of the House in the midterm elections, 2018. So there are mixed messages. Have the Democrats established a new majority? Are they the majority party? We may be in this period of de-alignment. And this leads us to the next PowerPoint slide on de-alignment. This is the last slide, I believe. This is the last slide for this section. De-alignment is a concept that many political scientists like now. They believe that the problems that America faces are so serious that no one party will be able to maintain control of the country over a long period of time. They believe that we'll simply back control of the White House and the Congress back and forth between the two parties because the issues are so difficult that no one party will be able to solve them. So the people will turn to one party, then to the next, then to the next, then to the next. So this is a belief that realignment is no longer a viable concept in political science. You have to decide for yourself whether or not you accept that or not. I have not accepted that, not quite yet, but I think the door is open and I'm not sure. Are we in a period of de-alignment? You have to be the judge of that. So this concludes our section on elections, okay? If you have questions on this, be sure to shoot them to me by email or eventually by a phone call, okay? All right, the next section that's coming up is political participation and political ideologies. We'll wrap up here and we'll turn to ideology and participation in a minute.